Miracle at Camp Friendship. Chapter 16. Goodbye to New Friends. The next 2 hours went by in a flash. Although Mr. Friendson and Pastor Gentle wanted to hear David's story, they gave us their full attention. "Rest for a few minutes while I go inside and see if the cook is ready for us," said Mr. Friendson. I asked him to have a little treat ready when we got back. What I wouldn't have given for another bowl of hobo stew just then. I would even have eaten some leftover oatmeal. When the dinner bell rang, it sounded so good, and we crowded through the door. There, on a table near the blazing fireplace, were big mugs, pitchers of steaming hot cocoa, and plates stacked high with giant cookies, raisin oatmeal, peanut butter, and old-fashioned ginger. Pastor Gentle said grace and thanked the Lord for safety on the hike and for the miracle of David's safe return. He also asked that Racer's Supersport would be found. Then we dug in. You have never seen cookies and hot cocoa disappear so fast. When we refueled, Aunt Ruth, Uncle Jake, and the restored and forgiven prodigal son David joined us. Mr. Friendson and Pastor Gentle asked most of the questions. Where have you been? Why didn't you let someone know where you were? Are you back to stay? It was just as Mr. Friendson had said during devotions that morning. David had received Christ as his Saviour as a boy, but when God spoke to him as a young man about total surrender to God's will, he refused to listen and ran away. For 14 years he had been running from God, but he had never run beyond God's loving call. He couldn't get away from God's conviction in his rebellious heart. He also couldn't get away from the prayers of his camp buddy, and especially the prayers of his father and mother, Uncle Jake and Aunt Ruth. "So what is God leading you to do now, David?" asked Pastor Gentle. "I'm home where I belong, and I want Camp Friendship to be my ministry, as well as Dad and Mum's. God works in marvellous ways. A train finally brought me this way, and I had to see what had happened while I was gone. When I stopped, I never intended to stay or let anyone know I was here. I was just another stop on my hobo journey. I spent one night in David's hideaway. That hasn't changed much." He chuckled. He knew what he meant. David continued. "The next afternoon, the Highland bus rolled up with my old buddy from summer camp days. 'You haven't changed much, buddy,' he said, grinning at Mr. Friendson and giving him a friendly slap on the shoulder. Then, when Pastor Gentle got out, I couldn't believe it. All my recollections of the old days came back, but 14 years make a big difference. Back then, he didn't seem so different. Now you both have a purpose in life. I don't. Look at us. I have nothing, and you both have a rich ministry to young people. It is you who have found real happiness and success." When he said that, I noticed tears well up in both Pastor Gentle's and Mr. Friendson's eyes. No doubt about it, we are important to them. It makes me want to serve the Lord even more. While we continued munching cookies and sipping hot chocolate, Uncle Jake said, "Tell them the rest, son." "Well, of course, I needed something to eat these last few days, so I scavenged food out of the kitchen. I have asked my parents to forgive me for that. Pastor Gentle, please forgive me for using your fishing line and hooks without your permission also." "You know, buddy," he said, grinning again with Mr. Friendson, "when you put that new lock on the kitchen, I had quite some time getting in." Mr. Friendson laughed loudly and slapped his knees at the thought of how his concerned repair had thwarted David's crime. It was a relief to know no dangerous criminal had broken in. "Go on," invited Pastor Gentle. He was anxious as to where to find out what else God had done in David's heart. "Well, I've been watching these young people." He gestured towards the tables, where we were stuffing ourselves with cookies and hot chocolate. "You didn't know I was watching you, of course, but your godly character and actions really made me stop and look at my own life." He turned again to Pastor Gentle and Mr. Friendson. "These young people need a place like Camp Friendship. There is plenty of work to be done around here, And I'm staying if Dad and Mum will have me. He looked at Uncle Jake and Aunt Ruth. A plea reflected from his eyes. Have you? Declared Aunt Ruth in a broken voice. Oh, son, you are an answer to years of prayer. As Pastor Gentle prayed, it is a miracle. Of course we want you here, if that is what God wants, and surely it is. Uncle Jake added without hesitation, All is forgiven, son. This is your ministry now. As Mother said, it is an answer to our prayers. We want you here. There is so much to do that I can't shake a stick at it, as Pastor Gentle would say. You can even fix up our old log cabin, and then we can move back in. Oh, wouldn't that be wonderful? Gasped Aunt Ruth, clasping her hands in front of her face. Tears squeezed out the corners of her eyes. We could have sat all day and listened to David tell of his life and adventures and hardships as a hobo, but our time at Camp Friendship was almost over. As Pastor Altruth had predicted, it was a memorable experience in more ways than one. I learned more about what it means to be, as well as to have, a friend. I learned how important godly character and actions are. But most important, I learned a valuable lesson about God's will and about God's patient working in our lives. Before we left, Mr. Frenson announced that Reginald and Hatford had won the scavenger hunt, and he presented them with a rustic-looking pine plaque. Burned into the plaque in crude lettering was, Good Woodmen's Award. I think we should have gotten an award too, complained Ronnie. After all, with my compass we kept everyone from getting lost. I remembered our squirrel-chasing adventure and raised one eyebrow at him. Now the only unsolved problem was Racer's lost supersport, and when David heard about it, he said, I'm sure it must be there at the campsite. Things can hide in the pine needles and grass. I'll go there tomorrow and look around. I feel certain I can find it. You pray for me, Racer, that God will help me, okay? I will pray very hard, assured Racer. I was already starting to like David. What a good buddy he must have been, I thought. I'm going to bring the bus around now, announced Mr. Frenson. Run to your lodges and get your sleeping bags and luggage. Be back here with everything in 10 minutes. Girls, I'll be up to Queen Esther's lodge in a short while to help you carry your things. When we got back to David's hideaway lodge, we weren't surprised to see Pastor Gentle's fishing line and hooks hanging on the nail beside the door. Inside, only a few coals remained in the old pot-bellied stove. The same old rusty beds were there, and the room was nearly as bare and drab as before, yet somehow it felt like home. Not home, but home away from home. I decided it was not the surroundings that made me feel that way. Having my friends nearby was what made me feel warm and at home. Although I loved my friends, I was so anxious to be home. I couldn't even imagine how much David, the hobo prodigal, had missed home while he was running from God. One last time we passed the washroom, and one last time we came to the fork in the path. The distance to the lodges had seemed so far the first time, but now it seemed short. The girls were coming, struggling with all their luggage. Mr. Frenson was helping them, and David had pitched in too. Miriam was pleading. Mr. Frenson, may Susie please take her pets home? I will make sure she keeps them in her pocket. Christy had something to say about that. Mr. Frenson, please don't let her bring them. They will get loose for sure, continued Sandy. Please, begged Susie. Mr. Frenson said, I have an idea, and he patted Susie on the head and strode off to the camp office. In a few minutes he was back with a quarter-sized glass jar with holes in the lid. You may take your pets home, Susie, if you will put them in this jar and let Miss Content keep them with her while we're on the bus. Finally, the bus was loaded and Mr. Frenson had one last instruction. If you enjoyed your time at Camp Friendship, go tell Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake, but keep it short and get right onto the bus. You can see storm clouds piling up, and he pointed toward the sky over the camp office. I believe the weather Reginald was predicting is headed our way. I'd like to be down the mountain before it gets here. When we said thank you, Aunt Ruth quietly said, It is so wonderful. And she dabbed some more at her eyes. She was talking about David's return, as well as our visit, I'm sure. Uncle Jake nodded to let us know he agreed. Young people are always welcome here, he said. It made me happy to see Aunt Ruth and Uncle Jake so happy. I will find that super sport for you, Racer, called David to a very grateful Racer, who was feeling better already. Then Mr. Friendson blew his whistle one more time. Come on, he said. We must get started down the mountain. I thought I felt a few raindrops as we ran to the bus and got on. Everyone took the same seats as before, except Mr. Thriftmore. He sat behind Mr. Friendson, I guess to keep him awake. Susie handed her jar of pets to Miss Content, and Ronnie stashed his backpack up in the overhead rack, as before. We flopped into our seats as Mr. Friendson cranked up the bus and pulled out. Waving from the windows, we could see that David had one arm around Aunt Ruth and the other around Uncle Jake. What a miracle of God's grace, love, and forgiveness, I thought. We were barely back onto the winding mountain road when I saw that Pastor Gentle was sound asleep with his head resting against the window. No games on the trip home. It was just sprinkling. But we all saw the dark sky and heard a distant rumble. A storm was coming for sure. Mr. Friendson turned the windshield wipers on slow speed. The tapping rhythm had its effect. Soon Booker and Racer, J. Michael and AC, Sandy and Christy were bunking up in their seats. Miriam and Susie were talking quietly. Only Reginald and Hapford were looking out of the windows. I don't know about you, I said to Ronnie, but I'm going to take a nap as soon as we are down this mountain. I remembered the road and wanted to make sure Mr. Friendson got us safely to the bottom. I saw the sign for falling rocks and mudslides again. I sure hope it doesn't start raining hard while we're on this road, I thought. That was the last thing I remembered for quite a while. When I woke up again, it was raining hard, and the windshield wipers were flipping back and forth on high speed. Lightning zigzagged down from the sky all around us, and thunder rumbled loudly. Since it was so dark outside, I figured it must be somewhere around 6 o'clock. We had made it down the mountain safely, and were on our way home. But we weren't there yet.